All right, good morning. My screen says we're live, so we're going to go with that. Welcome to Ask the Agronomist. It's good to be back with all of you. We're back here in our Macomb Nutrient Studios. It's been a long time since we've been here, and it's been even longer since I've had my co-pilot Adam here with me to help with production. So, Adam, appreciate you coming up. We're going to have a little fun here this morning. I've got props with me. I'm going to show a movie clip. We're going to go through. I got about 3 pages of notes here. This episode might go past an hour. I don't know. We'll see. Most of you are probably busy fixing a combine or moving a combine or doing something related to harvest and may not be watching live anyway. But the theme of today's episode is based on the epic Western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And if you're not familiar with that movie, you should associate yourself with it. So the 3 main characters of the movie were portrayed by Clint Eastwood. He got to be the good. Lee Van Cleef got to be the bad. And poor Eli Wallach got to be the ugly. So he was the one associated with ugly in the theme. So it's an epic spaghetti Western. If you're familiar with the spaghetti Western era, when a lot of Italian production teams were creating Westerns, they called those spaghetti Westerns because they were made either made in Italy or made by production teams based in Italy. It was made in 1966 when Clint Eastwood was a young, spry 36 years old. He's 93, I think now, which is pretty amazing that he's lived the life that he's lived. So that film was credited with catapulting him into stardom. Certainly wasn't his first film. He'd been on television prior to that, but that was kind of what made him a star in the minds of a lot of people. It was not well received by critics at the time because they didn't really like the spaghetti Western genre, but it has come to be known as the classic Western and one of the most iconic films ever made. Like I said, it was produced with an Italian production team, filmed mostly in Spain, interestingly enough, and it was the 3rd and final film in what's known as the Dollars trilogy, following A Fistful of Dollars and A Few Dollars More. Were the 2 movies that came before it. And even if you're not familiar with the movie, you will recognize the musical score and theme song, which I'm going to try to play for you now, that was composed specifically for the movie. So we'll see if we can make this work here. YouTube's probably going to make me watch a advertisement or something, but
I see some compliance training in your future.
Yeah. Yeah. Recognize that? Many times in the last 50 years has that sound shown up in something. All right. Well, we'll cut it off there just for the sake of time. That you're familiar with the music, even if you're not familiar with the movie. But anyway, so today's Good, Bad, and the Ugly has nothing to do with gunfighters or cowboys or Confederate gold. It has to do with the 2023 corn growing season, which I also consider to be a lot of good, bad, and ugly. And we're going to start with the good, which is generally what I like to do, and we'll work our way to the ugly. And you will find as we go through things here that in many cases, the bad and the ugly, well, the bad is just the opposite of the good, and the ugly is the bad on steroids, basically, is the way I would define it. So the top of the list of good relates to what, Adam? The weather, which where does weather rank in the 7 wonders?
Way at the top.
It's way at the top, and it controls all the other wonders and influences all the other wonders. And so catching more rain, and I'll preface that by saying at the right time, was really, really good this year. So we've had some corn plots that reps and dealers were actually nervous to share because they were too good. Because we've all got friends, we've all got customers, we all know people that have had some pretty tough, challenging growing environments. There's sub 200 bushel corn, pretty easy to find across the state. And there are people that have 300 plus bushel corn in isolated situations. And so some of those really high yielding plots, people were kind of nervous about putting that out there, that somebody might feel bad. So another big thing was avoiding the root lodging that occurred from the derecho on June 29th. I've got a lot of root lodge corn in my geography, specifically Hancock and McDonough County, parts of Warren County. And there is absolutely a big difference in late season health, the amount of crown rot, and the ultimate yield of corn, whether it root lodged or not. So root lodging by itself probably created, along with some other, wasn't only the root lodging, but the root lodging plus what the root lodging ended up kind of opening that corn up to, the additional stress, the damage on the roots, probably a 30 or 40 bushel yield hit just from that alone. I would say full season hybrids are trending to be better again this year. That's not uncommon, although I did have a plot where a 106 won the plot and a 118 was second. So they were the bookend hybrids on the plot. They were the earliest hybrid in the plot and the fullest season hybrid in the plot, and they went 1-2 and dominated everything else in the plot. So that's not much of a maturity trend there, but I would say, generally speaking, I would say full season hybrids have been better. Any hybrid that has good late season stay green or good late season health. So stay green means that the plant doesn't necessarily mean it has good foliar disease resistance. There's a difference. That's the reason we rate stay green separate from disease resistance. There are some hybrids that are highly resistant to foliar diseases like gray leaf spot, southern rust, other foliar diseases that have no stay green whatsoever. And you can have the flip of that as well. A hybrid that actually has quite a bit of foliar disease symptoms, but has good natural stay green. And that good stay green generally relates to late season root health, relates to crown rot tolerance, relates to other things that we talk about. So my next two have an asterisk beside them because early in the season, it looked like planting early was going to be the secret to success. Anything that got off to a head start, got roots down deep before it got dry, kept growing through the drought, never really showed. There were fields out there, if you're honest about it, if you look back, never really looked bad during the May and June drought. And then there were other fields, and they tended to be in different environments or planted later or a combination of things that looked like they were literally about to die in May and June. So just drastic differences. Now, as the season went along and other things that are influencing our yield, such as late season health, crown rot, things like that came into play, that kind of changed that planting date equation a little bit, because the later planted corn is without a doubt healthier than the early planted corn from a crown rot perspective. So if crown rot ended up being what determined your yield, early planting might have hurt you more than it helped you. If crown rot didn't end up being what determined your yield, the early planted is still better. So it kind of depends on another agronomist saying it depends. So higher fertility is in that same category. So early on, when we were dry and we had a lot of nutrient availability issues going on in corn, having more available fertility was a huge benefit. We saw huge responses from starter. We saw huge responses from banded fertility. We saw huge responses from just higher levels of fertility, which made it easier for those plants in a limited water situation to access the nutrition they needed. However, here's the caveat to that. That also increased your yield potential, and things that increase your yield potential increase your odds of getting derailed by crown rot later in the season. So in some cases, unfortunately, due to some of the late season disease challenges we've encountered, high fertility may have hurt you more than it helped you in the end. So we're not recommending low fertility, but high fertility can be associated with more severe crown rot. Sulfur in copious amounts was certainly a big benefit this year. Sulfur is a very water dependent, all nutrients are dependent on moisture in the soil for uptake. Sulfur is very much so that way. And so if you weren't using sulfur, or you weren't using enough sulfur, or the sulfur you applied was not available, it really showed when we were going through those dry stretches in May and June. I would say applying all of your nitrogen before planting was pretty positive this year, because at certain times, nitrogen that was applied after planting or side dress was really extremely unavailable to that plant, because we didn't get rainfall to activate and secure and make that nitrogen available to the plant. So the nitrogen that was most available to the plant was nitrogen that was probably deeper than 6 or 8 inches deep, because that's where there was still some moisture. And if you've got nitrogen in dry soil, there's nitrogen there, but the plant's not going to be able to access nitrogen in dry soil. So having your nitrogen on earlier and having your nitrogen applied deeper was probably a benefit this year. And in most cases, from a nitrogen standpoint, a lot of our fall ammonia fields probably look the best going through, again, that dry stretch in May and June. Now, I have had producers that have noticed that they think some of the fields that went through severe nitrogen and nutrient stress in May and June are healthier today than the fields that did not. Now, if that's true, I don't think they're healthier specifically because of the nutrient stress they went through. But if that nutrient stress reduced their yield potential, one surefire way to have healthier corn at harvest is to make it yield less. So if you have reduced yield potential before grain fill, your plants are going to be under less stress during grain fill. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Banded fertility was huge this year. Anybody using row starter, anybody doing like a root zone banding approach, if you put, anything you did to have concentrated nutrients closer to the corn roots, so the plant was more, it was easier for the plant to get to those nutrients, that was a benefit this year. Tillage was a pretty big benefit this year as well. We talked earlier multiple times on Ask the Agronomist about how much better the work ground looked, how much better it was to have less residue. Now, again, I put another asterisk beside that, because that's another one of those factors that, if you planted early, work ground, everything looked outstanding. You had, the best odds of having 300 bushel corn of anybody out there. And then crown rot, became a factor. That high yield potential that you set early, could have ended up becoming, part of the reason that we had some of the plant health issues late, because we'll talk about how hard these plants were working during grain fill to actually produce the potential yield that they had set during pollination, and the limited ability of that plant with reduced leaf area, reduced photosynthetic capacity because of the drought early, how much stress it was under trying to, fill that big potential. Any soil with higher plant available water holding capacity was a great thing this year. So, early on, it looked like, the good ground was going to be, maybe raise a crop, and the lighter soil was going to maybe be a goose egg. Thankfully that didn't happen. We got rain just in time. And so, we've probably got, I would say, if most people are honest versus what their expectations were going through the growing season, even the corn that seems disappointing is probably better than you thought it was going to be oftentimes going through the season. It's only disappointing now relative to the stuff that's really good. So, how good the good is, kind of determines how bad do you feel about the bad, and what, good and bad are relative terms. If the best corn in the county is 210, 200 is really good. If the best corn in the county is 310, 200 is a crop failure. So it's all a matter of perspective. So I would say spraying fungicide is definitely in the good category, but you needed to have the right product at the right rate at the right time. So with fungicide, I'd say there's 3 R's. Fertilizer, we talk about the 4 R's. Fungicide, there's three, the way I count them. Anything that enabled you to have better roots was a good thing this year. We had a lot of root issues. We'll talk about some of those in the bad list, but anything that allowed your plant to develop a better root system faster was a very beneficial thing this year. I would say from a trait platform standpoint, probably one of the biggest advantages I've seen to SmartStax genetics in the last, really since the rootworm era ended about 8 years ago. We definitely saw better late season plant health from SmartStax hybrids this year when you compare them to their double or Tricepta isolines. I have 2 or 3 theories as to what might be going on there causing that. One is some people feel that there is essentially a low level of rootworm pressure everywhere, and there are no such thing as a completely zero rootworm pressure field. And when you have a little bit of rootworm nibbling on your roots, that's opening that root system up for crown rot, causing stress on that plant and opening that plant up for other issues to come. So that would be one theory. I don't know that I subscribe to that theory myself. Theory number 2, which is kind of always been my personal opinion, is that SmartStax hybrids tend to yield a little bit less in the first place when you compare them to a double or Tricepta isoline. And that fact that they're trying to produce less yield is going to end up making them healthy because they're not going to stress themselves out so bad going through grain fill when stress occurs. My colleague Chris Carlisle has an idea that's going to, if he's able to find time to do it, where we can go out and sample some ears and count kernels and see if we can see a difference in kernel count between the different trait systems. The third theory, and this is kind of my own crackpot theory that I cannot prove. I don't know that there's any real evidence to support this. Just something that I wonder. When you move a trait into the corn genome, you're moving a little bit of additional genetic material with that trait. So there are some corn genes that come along with the trait gene. So it's not just a single gene. It is that gene for the trait, and then some associated DNA that was in that spot on the chromosome that comes in with the trait. So, we don't consider that to be, the hybrid is 99 point some percent the same, but it is not 100% the same. And is there some freak possibility that somehow there are some positive plant health genes associated with that Herculex rootworm trait? And that's what gives a lot of SmartStax hybrids, and not just SmartStax, any hybrid with that Herculex rootworm trait in it tends to have better stay green and better crown rot tolerance than a double or Tricepta version of that same genetics. It's not 100% true, but it's frequently that way. I would say we generally see a little better stay green, a little more grain moisture, and a little better late season plant health normally out of a SmartStax version. And we've said that before. I've never seen it be this dramatically different as what we've seen this year. And this is probably the first time it might have happened in 21 also, but it wasn't as dramatic. But I mean, this year, in what I would consider to be non-rootworm environments, we're seeing SmartStax versions of hybrids yielding 5 or 10 bushel more than a double or a Tricepta, which is very rare to see that. Typically, it's exactly the other way around. So I'll probably talk before we get done here about the wackiness of this year. This is probably one of the weirdest years from a weather pattern, weather event, impact on the crop, trying to make sense of things. Almost every day, somebody calls me with a story that seems unbelievable, but it's true. So, a 2-day delay in planting making 40 bushel difference in yield and drastic differences in the amount of crown rot in a hybrid. Tilled versus not tilled making 40 or 50 bushel difference in yield to the benefit of the not tilled. So we'll get to that here in a minute, because I just said tillage was a good thing, but I've seen in some cases where plant health was a problem, no-till fields finishing much, much healthier and much, much better than some of the work ground. So I'm going to put on the good category something I call less ambitious hybrids. If you were trying to make 250, you probably accomplished your goal. If you were trying to make 300, but lost plant health, you might have finished at about 220. So that's how something that was going to yield more ends up yielding less because it didn't finish well because of plant health issues, which were partly the result of the stress that those plants were under during grain fill, trying to accomplish the lofty goal that they had set for themselves. Pollination was good. Even places that had root lodging, severe root lodging on June 29th, which typically we're shooting some tassels by June 29th. This year, unless you planted some early corn early, not many people had any tassels showing before the 4th of July. So even the stuff that got blown flat on June 29th was able to get itself back up enough that it was able to pollinate really well. I saw very few pollination issues this year. We got rain just in time there. The last couple of days of June, first few days of July, we sailed through pollination with really minimal pollination issues. So pollination was good. Soil conditions at planting were probably the best that I can recall. We had a lot of days that were fit for planting in April. It would have been relatively easy if you were willing to push the envelope to have all of your planting done in April. And several people in Adams territory actually would have accomplished that this year. So we had lots of good soil conditions early. April was not dry, but it was not wet. We had lots of days where soil really worked up nice. We'll talk about some root issues that were pretty prevalent this year that might make you think we planted in the mud, but we generally did not. And the last thing I put on my good list was anything that promoted faster root development. And that was really kind of the key to either beating or avoiding the drought in May and June. If you planted early in a warm work soil and there was no root restrictions and those roots were able to grow and they were able to get down to depth before it got dry, those roots were able to continue growing because they were in moisture, versus the crop that got planted late, maybe had root restrictions, maybe it was in a harder soil, drier soil, harder to grow roots. That plant somewhat got trapped in the top 12 inches of soil, which by the end of June, the top 12 inches of soil didn't hardly have enough moisture in it to even support plant life, let alone plant growth. So anything you want to add or comment on that list, Adam, before we go into the bad?
No, I would say maybe one of the only other things as far as theories around the Smart Stacks Double Pro comparison that you were talking about earlier. You mentioned rootworm. You mentioned generally lower yield levels leading to Smart Stacks staying healthy, and also mentioned the potential for some of the Herculex genes coming along there that's helping with some stay green. But one other theory that's kind of out there right along the same lines as rootworm is nematodes.
Mm-hmm.
That some people think could be. I'm not sure where I'm at on all that, and I'm not sure that we've got an absolute answer for any of that, but that's another one, I guess, that people are curious about, is allowing nematode activity out there with stressed root, stressed year, allowing easier infestation for some opportunistic diseases, some fungi.
My thought on that would be, I mean, yes, it's true. We do put, Votivo, which is a biological nematicide, on all of our Smart Stacks corn, but not everybody does that. And across brands, I think I see the same trait difference. And so I kind of put that in the category I put the rootworm theory in. It's plausible, but I don't think it's very likely, because I think you can point to evidence that would kind of refute that theory.
I agree.
But
same thing with the rootworm for me. I feel like I've seen those dynamics not working consistently everywhere.
Yep. Okay, so let's move into the bad. So as I said, the bad is oftentimes just a mirror reflection of the good, is kind of the opposite. So we started the good with catching more rain. So I'm going to start the bad with missing key rains. So if you've got fields that, are surprisingly good or surprisingly bad to you, I would encourage you to use Climate Field View, go back into the historical weather data. We've shown you how to do that before here on Ask the Agronomist, and look at that rainfall data by farm. And you can say, it doesn't match my rain gauge. It won't. You know why? Your rain gauge is wrong. You know what else is wrong? Climate Field View is wrong. None of it's perfect, but it's a pretty good gauge of what that individual farm received. And sometimes half an inch or less difference in rainfall at the right time can make a pretty dramatic difference. And the difference could have been in April. The difference could have been in May. I've got one particular farm of soybeans that got hit pretty bad by sudden death. They happened to be the first field we planted, but we planted other fields on that same day and the next 2 days after that. So we had a lot of acres that went in that planting window. But this one particular farm, the Mother's Day weekend rain was 3.5 inches. And I really think that 3.5 inch rain on Mother's Day weekend might be what set those beans up to have a lot more SDS than most of my other acres did. Made 61 bushel, by the way. So not all the beans are making 80. So if you've had some beans that you were disappointed in, I did too. So misery loves company. All right. So second on my bad list is crown rot. Third on my bad, and these are in no particular order other than the order that the agronomist remembered them. Occasionally, if I remembered something like 10th, but I thought it was really, really important, maybe I would slide it up the list a little bit. But I did not rank these specifically. So I put tar spot on the list because you just can't leave tar spot out of any conversation these days. It seems like I don't think we had enough tar spot to really be a factor this year, but it is everywhere, and you can find it on every plant, and you will find more on some plants than others. And it was a stress, I think a small stress, but it was a stress during grain fill because it doesn't take, with diseases like gray leaf spot, for example, gray leaf spot, to do significant damage to your plant has to cover a significant percentage of the plant with a lesion. Tar spot seems to kind of reach a certain critical level where it's bad, but there's a lot of leaf tissue that's not infected, or maybe it is, and the lesion, you just can't see it yet, but then the plant just dies. So tar spot is a little bit unique. Now, we did not get to the level, in my opinion, anywhere that I have been this year, where tar spot killed any corn. But it all did have tar spot going through grain fill, and how much of an impact that had on it is hard to say. I don't think it was significant, but anytime I downplayed tar spot, I get a phone call from my good friend Jim Donnelly reminding me that even if nothing else is wrong, tar spot can still be really bad. So so I put tar spot on the list just out of respect for Jim. So I had soils with more plant available water on the good list. So soils with less plant available water are on the bad list. Compaction is on the bad list. So anything that, I talked about how anything that allowed for good root development was good. Well, anything that restricted good root development, which compaction will certainly do, is on the bad list. Related to that would be things like mohawk roots, roots getting trapped in the seed slot. We had a lot of that this year. And again, if you were digging roots this summer, you'd have thought people were planting in the mud. There was very little corn got mudded in this year. You would have had to really try hard to mud corn in this year because we had a lot of really, really perfect planting conditions. But we had moisture when we planted, especially if you planted early. It wasn't too wet to plant, but we had good moisture, and moist soil is easy to compact. And you always get some sidewall compaction with a planter. It is impossible. Even if you pulled the planter with an airplane, the planter itself will compact your soil. And if you've got a high-speed planter with a bunch of downforce on it to make sure that your rows aren't bouncing, you can create a lot of compaction with your planter. And normally, we get some rain in May and early June that softens that soil up, allows those roots to grow through that little bit of compaction that you created with your planter. No harm done. This year, we were so dry in some cases, we didn't get enough rain to kind of soften that seed slot up so where roots could grow normally. So there were mohawk roots in fields that were not planted in the mud. So if you were digging roots and you're finding hatchet roots, mohawk roots, and somebody was accusing you of planting in the mud, you probably didn't. It's just that it was so dry after planting. I mean, we had rootless corn this year. Rootless corn, I've seen that maybe twice in 30 years in central Illinois. I mean, it is so rare for us to be as dry as we were early in the season. Typically, we are suffering from too much moisture in April, May, and June. For us to be dry in April, May, and June is just weird. That's very, very, very rare for us. So where am I at here? So later planting dates with an asterisk. So again, we talked about early planted on the first list. In May and June, it looked like the late planted corn didn't even have a prayer. Some of that stuff looked like it was going to die. Now you get to harvest. In some cases, it's been better because it's healthier. So it depends on what's determining your yield. If premature death from crown rot determined your yield, early planting was bad, late planting was good. If ear size potential and yield potential, which is what's supposed to determine your yield, then early planting was good and late planting might have been bad. So it depends on the scenario that you're in. I have seen some mid-May planted corn. One of my FSRs took out a plot yesterday in the Monmouth area. There's been tremendous corn in the Monmouth area. That Highway 34 corridor going across Henderson County, Warren County, and Knox County. Whew, that's good. If you're going to brag about something in that part of the world, it better be close to 300 or I'd keep my mouth shut, because there is some freakishly good corn in that part of the world this year. Whether it was planted in April or May or June, for that matter, if you planted any June corn. So I've also got a category on here of hybrids I call high yielding genetics without good late season health. So if that's a category that you had some hybrids in and you had some crown rot and some premature death, that type of hybrid is the type of hybrid that tends to get hit worse by that scenario. That's also the type of hybrid that in 2022 was really, really, really good. And that's why people like to plant them, because when you get the right environment, they're really, really going to reward you with some phenomenal high yield. So I've got the whole 2023 growing season on my bad list. I just think that there's just so much weird about this growing season. Not all of it's bad, but it's all weird. We had, a near perfect April, which is weird. We had a very dry May, which is weird. We had a record dry June. We were setting up for a record dry June, which is weird, until the derecho hit, which is also weird. And then once it started raining, for some people, it never stopped. I've got parts of, that Highway 34 corridor that I just mentioned. There's quite a few acres in that part of the state that honestly, July and August had 16, 17, 18 inches of rain, just those 2 months. I've got parts of Logan County that didn't have that much for the whole growing season. Now, they both got pretty good corn considering, but pretty good Logan County corn's 245. Pretty good Warren County corn's 310. So there's a difference there, obviously. Root lodging was definitely bad. So anything that caused root lodging, and what caused the root lodging was 100-mile-an-hour derecho wind. But if for any reason you had a field, maybe the corn was bigger when the wind went through, it lodged worse. Maybe it was a weaker rooted hybrid, that lodged worse. Maybe it was a hybrid with root restrictions, that lodged worse. Maybe it was a really good high organic matter soil versus a timber soil. High organic matter soils root lodge worse because the soil tends to be more mellow and it's harder for the plant to anchor itself. So lots of things impact root lodging other than hybrid, and rootworm is not what was impacting the root lodging this year. But anything that made corn root lodge worse in the wind is in my bad category and definitely impacted yield potential. I think flowering early was a little bit of a drawback this year, especially in areas that were severely stressed and got hit by the wind. So if you were starting to shoot tassels on June 29th, that was not a good place to be. Those plants were closer to that critical pollination stage before they got moisture, and some areas some areas didn't get any rain when the derecho went through. I think we had about 2 or 3 inches at home. Some places had half an inch, some places had an inch, some places had none. If you didn't get rain on the day of the derecho, you had to wait till, maybe 4 or 5 days later in some cases before you got that rain. So that early planted, early flowering corn, even if it didn't get blown down in the derecho, if you missed that moisture that came with the derecho, that stuff was on the verge of a train wreck before it got its moisture. So getting moisture a few days more ahead of pollination was probably a good thing. So reduced leaf area. So plant height doesn't necessarily correlate to yield. So we've got plenty of 6 to 7-ish feet tall regular corn so we've got regular corn that is normal short corn stature this year, yielding very well. But what does get reduced that can impact yield is your leaf area. So if you had a way, this is very difficult to do. This is something you need graduate students to do, or a research tech like Adam that's working for peanuts when he worked for the university, just trying to get by. You can get somebody like that to measure leaf area on a hybrid, but that's a lot of, think about all the work would be required to measure how many square inches of leaf area there is on a corn plant. Well, leaf area is reduced by drought stress during vegetative growth stages. So although I don't have the data to prove it from my own data collections this summer, there is research that's been done by plant physiology groups that show that drought stress during vegetative development of a corn plant tends to produce smaller leaves, and you would have less photosynthetic capacity because it's your leaf area that's driving the yield of the plant. So what that's doing is it's reducing photosynthesis, which is reducing sugar production, which is going to reduce the potential for that plant to feed the ear. So the leaves, photosynthesis, capturing sunlight, producing sugar, feed the kernel, feed the ear, sugar gets converted to starch, and that's what we're growing with corn is starch. And so that whole process is driven by the leaf area of the plant. So the plant doesn't have to be tall to have a lot of leaf area, but whether the plant is short or tall, if you've got less leaf area, you've got less photosynthetic capacity. I would say emergence conditions. So while planting conditions were perfect, it was so cold. So when I say perfect, they were perfect from a soil moisture standpoint and soil tilth standpoint. They were not perfect from a temperature standpoint. I mean, it was extremely cold when we planted most of our corn. Now, our stand establishment was generally adequate. We did replant some corn. There was a lot of acres that were, borderline that some guys were thinking about replanting. In most cases, people left that stand. I'm guessing if we had a way to know, a lot of that stuff probably would have yielded better if it had gotten torn up and start over again replanting. But you may not have been able to plant the same hybrid that you had the first time, and you just all sorts of issues and challenges come with that. So I'm a believer in keeping a leavable stand because there's no guarantee that the replant's going to be any better. And if your replant's not perfect, then you're going to wish you would have kept what you had. So I'm not second guessing the decision to leave most of those acres that could have been replanted, but just the way things went from a plant health standpoint, I think replant corn probably would have been healthier in some of those scenarios because that stress, early planting, stress after planting, good black soils, that's ground zero for crown rot. So that is an environment where you're increasing your odds that you're getting a lot of pathogens into that root system. That in and of itself doesn't mean crown rot's going to kill your corn, But if you encounter stress later in the growing season with a lot of pathogens in your roots, that pretty well guarantees crown rot's going to kill your corn, prior to black layer. So it's that combination of the infection early, the stress late that makes it happen. We could have had just as much infection in our roots in 22, but we didn't have stress late. We had a very cool, moist, slow, easy, perfect grain fill period in 2022, which is primarily responsible for the late season health that we saw in the crop in 22. Both 22 and 23 had virtually no foliar disease pressure. We had very low levels of foliar disease. Even if you didn't spray fungicide in 23, you had very low levels of foliar disease. The benefit we saw from fungicides in 23, in my opinion, are all due to stress relief and suppressing crown rot. Don't have anything to do with, controlling a specific foliar disease. Adam, is there a question that came in on the chat there?
Oh yeah, Lance Loveless had a question. He says, any major yield or plant health differences between high and low population? Good question.
Oh, good question. Absolutely good question. So yes, there is a major plant health difference. So where plant health challenges exist, lower populations yielded more because they were healthier. The population impacts everything. It impacts the root mass of a hybrid. It impacts the ability of a plant to uptake nutrients. It impacts the level of stress the plant's under. So we are absolutely, by pushing populations to drive higher yield potential, we are opening ourselves up to more crown rot and more issues. And I'm actually going to start. This will be probably, I haven't really done this before, but I'm probably going to start with guys that, year in and year out are frustrated with really bad crown rot. I'm probably going to back down their populations. So if they're planting 36, let's do a 33 or a 34. That's still enough to raise a good yield crop, but we might be pushing stuff just a little bit too hard if you're fighting crown rot year in and year out. If you're not, then I'm not going to back that population down. But reducing populations this year definitely did keep stuff a little healthier. So if you planted less to begin with, or you had a reduced stand due to an emergence issue, I'll give you a good example. This is kind of an extreme example, but I plant some old plot seed on my farm, and this was the first time, ever really, that I've been bit doing that. And my colleague Chris Carlisle has historically used an old DeKalb hybrid called 6087 as his susceptible check in his crown rot trials. Well, Chris had a big pile of leftover 6087 from some of his crown rot work, and I didn't think about the fact that we probably haven't grown 6087 in I don't know, 5 years maybe. So the plot seed that he had left over from last year had already been left over several years. And then I didn't have it in cold storage. Like, when we keep old seed, we keep it in cold storage, humidity controlled. We retest it. We know it's still good. I, of course, stuck it in my barn and then threw it in my planter and put it in the field. Well, I ended up with about 20 acres of 6087 with a final stand of about 22,000. And I didn't catch it as early as I should have. So I made the little bit difficult decision to leave it. And that was the healthiest corn that I harvested this fall. It was greener and wetter than 6595 at 36,000 side by side. Now, it didn't yield as much as 6595 at 36,000 side by side, but it got a hell of a lot closer than I thought it would. And it was not healthy because it's a good crown rot hybrid. It's actually a very bad crown rot hybrid, but it had no crown rot in it whatsoever because the population was so low. So there is a population response to the crown rot phenomenon. We just got to make a decision, how much do we want to back down our yield potential to try to keep stuff healthier? Now, if you reduce your population and keep your plant alive, that's going to increase your yield, increase your yield that you achieve. So you can decrease your potential, but increase the real yield, because sometimes when you increase your potential and then a disease impacts you, you actually ended up reducing, by trying to increase. So I know that's I probably did a poor job explaining that, and I know when I talk about that, some of you think, oh, that's some agronomist making up bullshit to make excuses for his hybrids. But I really believe that everything you do to try to raise 400 bushel corn makes crown rot more likely to happen, from high fertility to high population, all that stuff. You're setting that crop up to be under tremendous stress during grain fill. And the crop has been bred to sacrifice itself to make as much grain as it can make. And if it sacrifices itself to the point it can't even live to black layer, dying before black layer takes away all the benefits of trying to yield more, and you end up yielding less. Let's see. So then the last thing I had, we just mentioned this, stress during grain fill. So stress during grain fill probably should have been number 2 on the list, not the last one on the list, because stress during grain fill is what causes crown rot to knock your plant out at the knees. If you don't have stress during grain fill, it almost doesn't matter how much crown rot infection is in your roots, because the infection really doesn't hurt anything if the plant's not under stress. And the more stress the plant's under, the worse it's going to get, the earlier it's going to die. If you die 2 days before black layer, your stock quality is probably not going to be great, but your yield's going to be fine. If you die 2 weeks before black layer, your stock quality is going to be horrible. Your yield's going to be off. If you die 3 or 4 weeks before black layer, that's the category we're going into next, would be the ugly. So any thoughts, Adam, before I delve into the ugly on the bad?
No. It's like you said, Lance. It's so variable this year as you're talking about all these different observations. I've seen several of those same observations, and I've seen things that contradict those observations that are hard to explain this year. I do think that temperature is something that we've talked about throughout the entire good and the bad, and maybe you'll get into in some way, shape, or form in the ugly. But I think overall we had stressful temperatures early on during early season growth, vegetative growth period, because we were so cold. We need heat. But I think some of the stresses that were induced early overall caused some of the problems that better temperatures mitigated later, if that makes sense. So, we started out stressing the heck out of these hybrids. It was dry, it was pretty cold, and overall we had a pretty cool year, which is good, except for early. Right. Having a cool grain fill period is excellent, because we're not burning up sugars at night that we produced all day. But I think that also exaggerates some of the situations that you just talked about, where we've got hybrids that are doing everything they can and throwing everything they've been able to minimalistically built from a sugar standpoint into an amazing opportunity of a year, from a great pollination period and great temperature. So, it's whether or not you got the rain, the crown rot. It's just, there's so many variability nuances this year that it's almost nearly a field right over here versus 5 miles away. It could be a completely different scenario as to how you explain what has happened.
So, and that's a good point that Adam brings up, and it is really the reason why, whether you are a farmer, a dealer, a seed rep, or an agronomist, the wise person probably ignores virtually everything they saw in 2023. You need to. It's like when the smart lawyer says something in the courtroom and gets objected to, and the judge goes, jury will disregard those statements. Oh, I bet they will. They already heard it. How are they going to disregard it? So you've already seen something. How are you going to unsee it? But you need to. 2023 would be a horrible year to make major changes in your farming operation based on. I mean, there's probably guys out there that were ready to abandon no-till and cover crops this summer. Shouldn't do that. I've got a good friend that through the whole summer, I mean, he was in agony over how challenging his corn crop looked. I mean, he's a good cover crop guy, a good no-till guy, knows what he's doing, has raised better corn that way than I do generally. But his crop did look tough this year. Now, in the last month, there's been a big turnaround there. He's got some of the best looking corn in the area, and it's so healthy he hasn't been able to harvest most of it yet because it's about 26% moisture yet, and it's a little wet for him. So he's going to harvest some really good corn on some fields that, I'll be honest with you, on about June 25th, he was starting to question whether he knew how to farm or not. So Adam makes an excellent point. I mean, we've been on an emotional roller coaster this year. So many things happen this year that are not going to happen next year. The only, every year we say this, right? Every year's different. Some different years are more different than others, and this is a really different one. So to me, this is one of the weirdest growing seasons I can recall. And all those little nuance things that Adam's talking about, we can't control that. We can't even explain some of it. And if you can't explain it, how the hell you think you're going to manage it or control it? So I would say take this year with a big grain of salt and don't overreact to this year. Just because of how weird it is.
Excellent advice.
So let's get to the ugly. So my number one top, and I did put this at the top for a reason on the ugly, is if your corn died before black layer, that's ugly. That's not a good thing. It's okay to be brown. It's okay for the tops to come out. It's okay for all the leaves to fall off. It's okay to harvest a broomstick with an ear. We've sold lots of hybrids over the years that we've positioned them as a broomstick with an ear. A great big ear that's going to make you lots of money. But they need to live to black layer. And if they don't, that's going to hurt. And the more prematurely they die, the uglier it's going to get. And there's some of that out there this year. Hybrids being punished for their optimism. And what I mean by that is it was a hybrid that was bred to yield, and it's hardwired to yield, and it doesn't care what's going on in the world. It's going to try to make you a bin buster yield. That's the way it was made. And when the environment doesn't play nice with that, that's extremely stressful on a hybrid like that. And stress is the culprit behind most of the bad things that happen to a crop. And some of these hybrids were just under a tremendous amount of stress. And I don't know the grower, but one of my colleague Chris Callow's growers, I think, is we attribute him for making the statement. It was a 150 bushel plant trying to produce a 300 bushel ear, and what he meant by that was, in May and June, we were going to be lucky to raise 150 bushel corn. Lucky. I don't think everybody understands how close we were to a 2012 or 1988 yield level. I appreciate the fact that you all think that we've bred corn that doesn't need rain. But that is not true. If have you heard about the place in Missouri that's basically got no corn? Well, that place in Missouri, they didn't get the early July rain that we did. If we hadn't got the early July rain, we'd be raising Missouri corn. So we have not bred corn so that it doesn't need rain. We have bred it to withstand more stress. We have bred it to yield more, but it still takes a lot of rain to raise corn. And had we not gotten the July rain, we'd be harvesting a lot of sub 100 bushel corn. There would have been fields that would have been every bit as bad as anything you raised in 2012. So, we dodged a bullet this year getting that as much rain in July as we did. Now we did illustrate, and I've said this for years, the one thing nationally that correlates to corn yield, it's not planting date, it's not planting population, it's not fertility level, it's not even soil type. It's how much rain do you get in July? Rain in July is the number one. Now some people had like 10 inches in July. which in a normal year would have ruined their crop. But following the May and June we had, 10 inches in July was, it's just what the doctor ordered, because we were 2 months behind on rainfall. So if you got 2.5 months worth of rain in July, hell, that's perfect. But if we'd had a wet May and a wet June, and then you had 10 inches of rain in July, holy crap, that would have been 2015 all over again. So it's, the way the year played out, we were very, very fortunate. Everybody got enough rain in July to survive. The people that got too much rain in July didn't get hurt by that because they'd had so little in June. And so that worked out well. We could have spread it out a little bit better. We didn't, not everybody got enough rain in late July. Some places by late July, early August, it was as stressful as it had been in June, because if you only got 2 or 3 inches in early July, following nothing in June, by late July, that 2 or 3 inches was gone, and you were right back in the same drought you were in June. So next on my list is severe crown rot. So that's actually, what's causing the dying early. So those two are kind of somewhat the same thing. The derecho, typically was, there's a lot of ugly associated with that. That's got nothing to do with corn production. I mean, I love shade trees. I love old farmsteads. I love the picturesque, countryside that we have here in Illinois. And a lot of that's gone for people in parts of Hancock and McDonough County. And that's just sad to me to, have to go through that. So a lot of ugly with the derecho, and not all of it related to corn. The record dry June, that was certainly ugly at the time. Now, as it turns out, the record dry June didn't end up being, a major factor, although it is still a factor, because that's the reason our leaf area was reduced. That's the reason we had this dinky, runny little plant trying to set this monstrously big ear. So the 150 bushel plant trying to grow the 300 bushel ear. We had dry periods in July and August. Some places had severe dry stretches in late July, early August. We really had, I've summed it up this way, in a lot of places, we had kind of 3 rainy periods: Mother's Day weekend, 4th of July, and the second week of August. And in between those 3 rainy periods, we had a drought that was just periodically interrupted with rain. And some places were interrupted with 6 inches of rain, and some places were interrupted with an inch of rain. And if your droughts were only interrupted by an inch of rain, that's pretty bad. If your drought was interrupted by 6 inches of rain, then it's almost like you didn't have a drought, which you didn't. Most places by the time the year's over, we're going to have average rainfall for the year. That's kind of the way it generally goes. We just didn't distribute it very effectively. So I'm going to say nutrient deficiencies are on this list. Now, I don't think the nutrient deficiencies ended up being near the ugly, nasty thing that crown rot and premature death did. But, the plants were nutrient stressed all through the growing season. They really never caught up. When those plants went to cannibalize themselves to finish that ear, there was fewer groceries on the shelf in the plant for that plant to steal to finish the ear. And so it had to sacrifice itself even more, because the cupboard was kind of bare when it went looking for something to eat, when it couldn't get things supplied through photosynthesis the way it wanted to. The Mohawk roots were certainly ugly. I got some pictures of some of the worst Mohawk root systems I've ever seen. And, I've seen guys plant in absolute freaking mud have better root systems than some of what I saw this year. So this year was a good reminder that dry soils do not produce good roots. Wet soils produce bad roots. Dry soils do too. It's moist soils that produce good roots. You have to have moisture for root growth. Roots cannot grow in dry soil. Roots do not grow to moisture. Roots grow in moisture. And the corn plant is not consciously thinking, oh, damn, it's dry around here, I better get some roots down. It doesn't work that way. The plant just grows roots unless it can't. And it can't grow roots if it's too wet because there's no oxygen. It can't grow roots if it's too dry because there's no moisture. and it can't grow through concrete. And this year we had some soil that was as hard as concrete with no moisture in it, and that does not support good root growth. So do not get sucked into thinking that, hey, because it's dry, I'm going to have really good roots. We had horrible roots. That's why we had so much root lodging from the derecho. Were any of you surprised there was almost no green snap and all this root lodging, even though the soil was dry as a bone? Usually we think of root lodging on wet, saturated soils. This year we had the driest soil in June we've maybe ever had, and widespread root lodging. Now, we didn't have green snap because the plant was so rubbery because it was drought stressed. It wasn't very brittle. So that's the reason it didn't snap. But the other reason it didn't snap was it was so easy to blow the roots over. So we did not have good roots under a lot of this corn because it was too dry. So ironically, and it is true that a soil that's a little bit dry probably does grow better roots than a soil that's a little too wet. But we were in an extreme dry situation this year, and extreme dry does not support good root growth either. And then the last one on here, this is probably a little bit hard for some farmers, because sometimes you've got maybe 4 or 5 points difference in moisture in a field. But there were some split planter fields that I wanted to salute the U.S. flag, because you had green strip, brown strip, green strip, brown strip across the entire field. Looked like a flag. Probably more bad for the seed company that owned the brown, and good for the seed company that owned the green from an appearance standpoint, but also caused a problem for the farmer, because there might have been a 5 or 6 point difference in moisture there. So we actually promote split planter trials because it's a great way to compare two hybrids. I don't particularly like managing split planted fields, because it's really hard to, if you got two hybrids out there that need two different forms of management, you can't manage that field perfectly for both hybrids if you got them in a split planter. So some of those split planter fields were ugly, or embarrassing, maybe more than ugly for. So I'm sure there's some good aerial shots out there of some fields that it'll look like you were making some art of some kind, like people draw designs in their fields with GPS and stuff. I had a customer that he put his retailer's company logo in a field using two different maturities of soybeans, and it was beautiful. I don't know how much they're going to compensate him for all the good advertising that they got, but it was really cool. So anyway, that's kind of the end of my ugly list, and anything we can do to reduce the ugly, and increase the good. I forgot. I brought props today. This, while we're on the ugly list, my ugly yesterday. If you're familiar with this used to be a separator belt off of a 9770 John Deere combine, and that exploded. And when that happened, I slugged. I slugged some heavy. I was in some really good soybeans, and a big wad of them fed into the feeder house, and slugged the machine, and got the slug out, and was checking things over, and discovered that belt was exploded. And when this belt came off, it ruined a second belt. And so we're fixing the belts, putting stuff back together. And luckily, before I started it up with the new belts, I thought, I better check and make sure that we found the real problem. And here is the real problem. So this is the remnants of an old hedge post. So over here in Western Illinois, we have things called fences because we have something called livestock. And so you'll occasionally find an old hedge post that's a plant is a weed out of, or a weed is a plant out of place. Well, this is a hedge post out of place because it was laying in a bean field. And I was joking with Adam earlier. I wish this post is, this thing's probably 100 years old, and it is as solid as the day God made it. And I wish we could buy some treated lumber that was as resistant to decay as good old Osage orange is. But this actually, we beat on it, we chiseled it, we had an air hammer working on it. You can see there where we tried to drill a hole in it because we were going to run a cable. But my last idea to get it out of there, we we were starting to think we might actually have to start dismantling the combine. This thing was wedged in there so tight. We actually were able to get a cable around it, and I pulled it out of there with a truck, is how we ended up getting it out of there. But that puppy she was in there tight. So anyway, that was my ugly for yesterday. So I don't think I see any more questions coming in on the chat. Any parting thoughts, Adam? We are past time here.
I know we're a little past time, but I've had this conversation with several people, so I thought we should probably address the green leaves.
Oh yes, thank you. I was going to do that and I forgot. So if you're the first question I'll ask is, what are they yielding? If your green beans are yielding 70 plus and they're good beans for the area you're in, I would say a lot of times in high yield environments, if you talk to anybody that's trying to win a soybean yield contest, it's fairly common that they desiccate those plots because they create an environment where the soybean plant is so healthy, so happy, photosynthesizing at such a tremendous level that, Dr. Bilo has always said that soybeans are source limited, meaning they can't produce enough photosynthetes to feed all of the seed that they could produce. But if your soybean plant has been able to produce more photosynthetes than the seed it's carrying can use, you're going to end up with an accumulation of sugars in the plant, which keeps that plant healthy almost forever. So what I would say is look at the pod count on those plants. Generally speaking, the green plants that are just green as grass, still got their leaves on them, will oftentimes have either lower pod number or fewer seeds per pod or more aborted seeds on them. And oftentimes the greenest parts of the field are not the highest yielding part of the field, but it's the lowest yielding part of the field. And if that's the scenario you're seeing, it's a lack of seed load on that plant that is giving it an excess of photosynthetes because we had really good moisture in August. And in some cases I see this most often on sands. On sandy soils, beans will nearly die going through the growing season. They're small, they don't have many pods, they weren't going to yield much in the first place. And then if you get a lot of rain late in the season, the things almost come back to life. They can't start flowering again, but they're just vegetatively still alive. And the seed is dry, the seed is mature, but the plant didn't die. So we more often have complaints from people about why are my beans dead? Why are my beans not yielding well? What are these areas in the field that are darker in color? And they're often lods, and you've got dead leaves and petioles and all kinds of trash hanging up in the beans. Those are areas that died prematurely from SDS, pod and stem blight, diaporthes, some sort of soybean pathogen. It's essentially crown rot doing the same thing in soybeans that crown rot does in corn. That's what those dark gray, dead, sooty, black cloud of dust when you go through it. Yield monitor drops to 30 bushel when you go through that spot. If you've got green spots where yields are depressed, that's kind of the opposite. That would be a soybean plant that, due to stress through the growing season, had not enough pods, not enough seeds, aborted too many seeds, aborted too many pods, and there's just not enough grain on that plant to essentially kill the plant. So the plant kind of lives until it freezes, basically. So some of these green beans are going to be green for a long time. If you can get through them, I'd say go ahead and cut them, because they're not going to mature normally at this stage of the game. So you're probably talking a freeze to dry those beans out. So rather than wait for that, I'd cut them if you can get through them. You could desiccate them if you want. There are products that are labeled to apply to defoliate, desiccate, dry out, kill a plant that's not dying. But you might not want to spend money on that at this point. But I've had people complain about beans that were green and tough making 90. And I've had people complain about beans that were green and tough making 45. And that is two different situations going on there. I had a colleague that was asking questions on our group chat yesterday about beans that were green and tough and making 90. And the comment from one of our other colleagues was, "Well, get back to us when you have a real problem," because they weren't too sympathetic to his tough to cut 90 bushel soybeans. But tough to cut 45 bushel soybeans, that sucks. I sympathize with you there. And I walked some acres yesterday in Hancock County in a very stressful area that have a lot of really green beans that just look like they're not maturing normally. And when you inspect those plants, there's just not enough pods there. There's not enough seeds there. You've got one bean pod, you've got two bean pods, you got a three bean pod with one seed in it. You can just tell that plant was going through hell in July and August during the grain fill period, and just really struggling. And then late in the season, we've had some good rains. Plant kind of perked back up. So vegetatively, the plant's happy as a lark. And primarily, it's kind of like that corn plant with no ear on it. That's green till Thanksgiving. That's got that purple stalk that looks like it's immune to every corn disease out there, and it is, because it's got such a high concentration of sugars in the tissue because it had no ear to put them in. That's what's going on with these green beans in most cases. If you're seeing low yields, if you're seeing high yields, well, then you've just done a really good job, you and Mother Nature, of creating an environment where that bean is living such a good life. In the South, it's a lot more common to use defol and desiccants and stuff. We have to do that. That's common practice in cotton. So the soybean growers in the South are more used to doing that because they're used to doing it in cotton. And our high yield soybean producers that are trying to win a yield contest will often use a defoliant or a desiccant or something so that you can actually get the bean harvested, because the grain is mature, the grain is ready to harvest. Hell, the grain might be 8.5% on a plant that's almost looks like wheat beans. It's so green. So that's what's going on there. Adam, anything you want to add to that?
No, you covered it pretty well. I just had some situations come up. Neighbors' beans, no leaves, stems are good and brown. They look like you want them to look.
Yep.
And they've got some beans that have got some leaves on them. They got some green stems, some green petioles, and things like this. And you did a good job of explaining the dynamics of both ends of the spectrum,
right?
Why you can have green stems.
Yeah,
because that's something that's important to understand, is that it doesn't mean things are good. It doesn't mean things are bad.
Right.
It depends on the situation.
Right. So far, my worst beans have been my deadest beans. Yeah. But some people's worst beans are their greenest beans. Mm-hmm. So depends on the situation. So,
all right. Back on the 19th.
All right, back on the 19th. Thanks everyone for your questions, and we'll be back with you soon. Take care. Stay safe.